All right, folks, we can finally get started. Thank you for doing that. I appreciate it. Hope everybody's doing well. Hope everybody's having a smooth week. We didn't have class on Tuesday, so hope you guys took advantage of that time in one way or another. So we've got 3 weeks left after today's class. So not a lot of time left. We're going to cover about four more chapters, I think, after this one. So there's a decent amount of material being covered. Today we're going to continue covering monopoly, the case of a market where there's only one firm dominating and defining the market, essentially, which we started on last Thursday. We won't finish today because it's a long chapter, but we'll finish it up on Tuesday, and then we'll start on 14 on Tuesday, and then we'll finish 14. And I think there might be 3 more chapters after that. Monopolistic competition. Yes. So there's like 5 chapters in total that we're covering the second part, or the last part of the course. So beyond the requirements of my class, you've got other stuff going on. There's going to be a lot of assignments, exams, etc., all kind of coming up at once in the next 3 weeks. So it's really important for you guys to be really plugged into this whole process right now, really aware of what's coming up, how much time you guys are going to have, and just like manage it the best way possible so that you do not wind up in a situation where you are just hurrying to get things done and kind of learning things over here, and then ultimately kind of, you know, not doing that great in this last part of the semester, which is like the most important part, right? Because that's where your grades are finally determined. So make sure that you guys are really putting in everything you have into these last few weeks. It takes a lot out of you, and it's just a normal part of this process. It's what you signed up for. Don't run away from it. Embrace it. If you do, you'll suffer through it, and then when it's over, you will have like this whole great summer to kind of bask in the afterglow of success and just feel good about all of this that you did. Get a good amount of time to decompress, to kind of reboot, and then just have a clear sort of mindset for whatever comes next. So just make sure that you, again, are just all about confronting this now. Don't shy away from it this weekend. Make sure you take care of things. You have a couple of weeks before finals start, and if you use that time responsibly, if you use it like in a way that you know is going to not leave everything to the last moment, then those last moments, that last week of finals, doesn't have to be a nightmare. It doesn't have to be horrible. You know, it's all about just like always being like actively like taking the semester on versus like trying to run away from it and then just like, you know, dealing with it when you have to, because that's the wrong approach, and that's what leads to bad results. All right, so before I get into the material, anybody have any questions you want me to address about anything? All right, very good. All right, so again, monopoly. This is the second of the context that we're studying optimal decision making in by firms. We started this whole sort of journey last part of the course, the second part of the course, when we started off learning about marginal analysis, and then applied the approach to decision making on the part of consumers. Then we moved to the side of producers, and we kind of developed a framework of costs that reflected production, that then allowed us to analyze optimal decisions by firms in perfectly competitive markets. The end of the competitive spectrum, where a market is as competitive as possible. And now we are looking at the other end of the spectrum, using that same framework, same ideas, to analyze how firms in these type of markets, where there's only one firm, can best sort of you know, take advantage of the situation, make profits, set prices, set quantities. And so again, like the reason why we do these two extreme ends first and then kind of go away from them is because anytime you're doing any kind of analysis, it's always good to kind of establish what are the bounds of like the area that you're playing in. So here we're talking about like firms selling in markets, making decisions to sell. Well, you're going to look at the most competitive setting and the least competitive setting, and then we're going to look at the in-between settings that are the most common settings where you'll find most firms in most industries that you are aware of operating today. And we'll talk about those cases in the next like week and a half, and you'll see why those cases are a little bit more intricate and complicated and ultimately more realistic, which is where that complication comes from. Anyway, so we were talking about how monopolists can maximize profits, so we will finish talking about that. Then we'll talk about monopolies and public policy, the fact that in a monopoly, a firm has a lot of power, and they take advantage of that power in order to make as much in profits as possible, but that leads to high prices for consumers. It leads to deadweight loss, a hit in terms of the surplus that exists in the market. And so because of that, governments do tend to have a hand in these types of markets. And so we'll talk about the policies that sometimes they enact in order to try to mitigate the adverse results of a monopolist dominating the market. And then finally, the last section of the chapter, which we may or may not get to today, focuses on the fact that these firms have what's called market power, the ability to price above their marginal cost, and how they can fully take advantage of that. How they can fully take advantage of it is by price discriminating, charging different people different prices. If they are able to either figure out or maybe estimate how much the willingness to pay of each person is and actually be able to charge them that, then they'll actually be able to capture the consumer surplus that exists in the market and turn it into profits. And so we'll talk about different ways that firms go about doing these things. They're going to be familiar to you because you've been dealing with these sorts of like strategies by firms your entire life. You just haven't had a name for it. So we'll talk about that either the end of today or next Tuesday. Again, likely we're not going to finish chapter 13, so there again will not be homework this weekend. So that'll give you a slight break on that. But there will be homework coming up, so don't get too happy. Class is not over yet. All right, so the meaning of monopoly. So again, this is stuff we covered last week. A producer is a monopolist if it's the sole supplier of a good that has no close substitutes. Whatever it is they're selling, nobody else is selling it. A firm is a monopolist in an industry that is a monopoly. All right, so the thing that is most important to understand about a monopoly is that they have market power. Again, the ability to charge their prices above their marginal cost. So this is where you would have the outcome for the market be if the market were a perfectly competitive market. It would, again, happen at the intersection of the market demand curve, which is made up of the demand of all individual buyers, and, of course, the market supply curve, which is the sum of the individual firms' marginal cost curves above the minimum of the average variable cost. And where they intersect is where we get the competitive price and competitive quantity for those markets. What a monopolist does is they take advantage of the fact that they can charge a higher price, so they will generally limit the amount of the good that's being sold in the market, so they can charge a higher price. And what happens is then you wind up having less transactions occur in these markets than would in a competitive setting. Why do monopolies exist? Well, it's because there are barriers to entry. So when we talked about the perfectly competitive market setting, we talked about the fact that there is free entry and exit in the long run, which means that if there are profits being made, that firms will enter in the long run and they will erode those profits. The supply curve will shift to the right. It'll lower the equilibrium price. And so any difference between the price being charged and the average cost of production will close, and price will equal the minimum of the average total cost in the long run, reflecting the fact that there are zero economic profits. in a monopoly, there are barriers to entry. Something is stopping other firms from entering these markets and competing, and so that is keeping firms out. So even if there are profits in a monopoly setting, those profits will be maintained by the sole firm that dominates and defines the market. So there are economic profits in the long run for monopolists because there are barriers to entry. So what are the barriers to entry? We went through them last time. Control of a scarce resource or input, something you need to produce. If nobody else can get that thing, you can be a monopolist. Increasing returns to scale. You have to be a certain size in order to have a cost advantage. So let's say you're operating along your average total cost curve. Here's the demand curve. And so in order to be able to sell in this market, you would need to be able to be this big, like somewhere down here. And so if you're not able to be that big, meaning that you've been able to invest a large amount of fixed costs into the operation, setting up, maybe large plants or maybe large distribution networks for your good, then you will not be able to enter the market, and that will keep other firms out. So if there's increasing returns to scale, decreasing average total cost, and the firms are operating along this range here, then any other firm that would want to compete would have to be there as well. And so if the cost of setting that type of scale enterprise up is too big, it will keep other firms out. And there are situations in which it is natural for there to be only one firm. We'll talk more about this later when we're talking about policy. We talked about also technological superiority as a barrier to entry. If, again, you have the technological means to produce something and nobody else does, you're going to have a monopoly over the production of the good being produced. Network externality. There are network effects sometimes in industries when the thing that's being sold tends to take on a lot more value the more people use it. And so even though the thing being sold may have substitutes, the fact that most people are only buying the one type, like I talked about last time, I talked about the operating systems and how Windows is not necessarily something special as far as the programming for an operating system. Anybody can come up with that knows how to program, but they are the one that everybody uses. So the fact that all companies use it, most people use Windows that don't have Apples, that don't use Linux, then that makes their product very valuable, and it allows them to sell a very high volume, which then gives them very low costs. The only way anyone else could compete against them is to be that big, and generally you will not have, most firms that try to enter these markets will not be able to do so. That's why you don't see competitors for Windows. So it could be network externalities, where the value derives from enabling its users to participate in a network of other users. It may be a network externality that creates a barrier to entry to other firms, much like the user base for Microsoft Windows. And of course, a government-created barrier, some kind of legal barrier, either protecting an invention or protecting like an idea via a patent or a copyright. If a firm has the right to basically produce the one thing that they've been able to create, then obviously nobody else will be able to produce it. But that kind of protection is eroded over time. If it's a patent for like something that's been invented, those kind of things can usually be reverse engineered, and other companies may not produce the exact version of what's being produced, but maybe a slightly different one, which is enough of a substitute in consumers' eyes that it would erode monopoly power. Even so, patents do last between 16 to 20 years, eventually expiring. Copyrights also, the claim to a literary or artistic work. These sorts of things do tend to be eroded as well. In this case, in the United States. In the case of the United States, it's usually for a period equal to a creator's lifetime plus 70 years. And again, like, even though you might have a monopoly within a country, like international laws may not be as specific, and so you may not have a monopoly with your ideas internationally, because anybody can just take your concept and use it however they choose if there aren't specific laws internationally protecting imported ideas. So there's definitely holes to these things, and that's why ultimately you don't see a lot of monopolies in practice. But firms are always interested in either becoming monopolies or working towards having monopoly power, because obviously that's how firms can make the most amount of profit. All right, so let's talk about how monopolists maximize profit. We started last time talking about the fact that in a perfectly competitive market, the perspective of a firm on the market is that they are a price taker. They cannot affect the price, and therefore the demand curve they face is a perfectly elastic, flat demand curve at the market price. For a monopolist, their perspective on the market is the market demand curve. They are the only firm in the market, and so they are beholden to the fact that if they want to supply more, they have to lower their price, and if they want to supply less, they have to raise their price. They can only sell as much as people are willing to pay for, versus in a perfectly competitive market, the firms can sell as much as they want, but at the market price. So the fact that the monopolist faces a downward sloping demand curve means that the marginal revenue, the extra revenue gained by selling additional units, is going to be less than the price. Whereas in a perfectly competitive market, the marginal revenue is equal to price. And so when the firm is doing their marginal analysis to figure out how much they should supply, they look at the price and they compare it to marginal cost. And at the point where price equals marginal cost, that's the point of supply for them. That maximizes their profits. Because marginal revenue is less than price for a monopolist, then essentially the monopolist is not going to look at price as compared to marginal cost. They're going to look at marginal revenue as compared to marginal cost to maximize their profits. So let's look at why, again, marginal revenue is less than price. The reason is because as the firm wants to change the amount they're selling, they have to move along that demand curve, which means that they're going to gain extra revenue by selling additional units, called the quantity effect, but they're going to lose revenue by lowering the price on existing units in order to be able to sell more, and that's called the price effect. And so we looked at that graphically. This curve right here is the marginal revenue curve, representing the fact that it is less than the price at any given quantity. And again, it has to do with the fact that, like, as the firm wants to move along the demand curve, they're going to gain some revenue and then lose some revenue. So here, the firm was initially operating here, selling 9 units at $550. To sell that 10th unit, they had to lower the price on all units to $500, which is $50 less. So they sold 10 more units. 10 times 50 is equal to 500. So the quantity effect of this price change is $500. But in order to do that, they had to lower the price on the 9 existing units by $50. So the price effect is a loss of $450. So therefore, the marginal revenue of selling that 10th unit is equal to $50, which is less than the price of course, $500. As opposed to a perfectly competitive firm that if they were to increase their quantity from 9 to 10, they would have extra revenue of the price they charge for that 10th unit. They wouldn't have to account for loss in revenue from lowering prices. So therefore, price equals marginal revenue for the perfectly competitive firm. Monopolists, not the case. Marginal revenue is less than price. So we get this marginal revenue curve below the demand curve. It happens to be twice as steep as it, having twice the slope in absolute value, and the intercept is half of the intercept of the demand curve. Down here we see the total revenue curve, basically telling us what's happening to the overall amount of revenue the firm is earning as they are moving along their demand curve. Well, we see that up to a point, that Gesundheit, up to a point, the quantity effect, the extra revenue they gain by selling additional units, outweighs the price effect. And so the marginal revenue is positive. So the extra revenue they gain by selling additional units is positive, which means that their total revenue is increasing. And so we see that up until this point here, where total revenues are at their maximum. It's at the point where marginal revenue hits the horizontal axis, which means that marginal revenue is equal to 0. And then we see marginal revenue becomes negative after that, which means that the price effect overtakes the quantity effect by selling additional units. So selling additional units, the extra revenue gained by selling them is less than the amount that you lose by lowering the price on existing units. And so that actually results in negative marginal revenue, which results in a negative total revenue relationship beyond this point. So obviously the firms have to be very cautious of this, not to get into this area where they're actually lowering their total revenues. And therefore monopolists will only operate along the range where marginal revenue is positive, obviously. All right, so that's the marginal revenue curve. Now we're going to compare it to the marginal costs, and again, identify the optimal point of supply for the monopolist. All right, so here again is a simple monopolist with their demand curve and their marginal revenue curve. We're going to assume that the marginal cost of producing an additional unit. Here we're talking about De Beers diamonds. So remember, De Beers diamonds was the example at the beginning of the chapter that talked about the fact that this company bought up all the mines in South Africa, where most of the diamonds are produced, therefore gaining control over the supply of diamonds, therefore being able to artificially increase the price of diamonds. So we're assuming that the marginal cost of producing an additional diamond for De Beers is constant at $200. So just for this one case here, we're going to assume marginal cost is constant. So it's just going to be a straight line. That means that average total cost will also be constant, just to keep the analysis simple for now. So in order for average total cost to be constant, there have to be no fixed costs. That's what we're assuming here. All very simple. All right, to maximize profits, the monopolist will compare their marginal revenue against, of course, the marginal cost curve. So let's say they're operating over here, maybe selling, 3 or 4 units, and they want to increase. So they have to, again, think about their marginal analysis in order to answer the how much question, in this case, whether to produce one more unit or not. So they compare the marginal revenue, the extra revenue gained by selling additional units, to the marginal cost, the extra cost of producing additional units. And obviously along this range, marginal revenue exceeds marginal cost, so they would continue selling more up until they get to the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That's the point where they would stop. Beyond that point, marginal cost would exceed marginal revenue, and it wouldn't be worth it to them to sell more units. So the monopolist maximizes its profits by using the optimal output rule, set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. So this will be the monopolist's optimal point of output. In this case, 8 diamonds are being sold, and 8 diamonds are being sold, and now having established how much the monopolist is going to sell, the monopolist then needs to figure out how much they need to charge consumers. So that's the extra step that the monopolist takes. Again, not being a price taker, they have to first figure out how much they're going to sell and then figure out what they're going to charge. Of course, what they're going to charge is going to be based on what people are willing to pay. And so for 8 units, we have to go up to the demand curve. At 8 units, the price people are willing to pay is $600. So therefore, that is the price that the monopolist will charge. They will charge $600. Certainly not equal to marginal cost, as is the case for a perfectly competitive firm. So you see already there that there's a significantly high markup that is completely reflective of the market power that the monopolist has. All right, so at this point, the average total cost of producing is $200, is equal to marginal cost. So the monopolist will earn a profit of the $600 they get to charge minus the $200 it cost them on average to produce. So $400 in profit per diamond times the amount of diamonds being sold, which is 8 units. So 8 times 400 is equal to $3,200. And so that's how much the monopolist is able to make in this example. And that amount can be represented graphically by this rectangle here, which is, again, the difference between the price and the average total cost times the quantity being sold. Yeah?
What about that triangle the marginal revenue and the demand? What is the triangle?
You're talking about this? This part here? It doesn't mean anything. No. So the marginal revenue is relevant because that's how they set their optimal output decision. They compare marginal revenue to marginal cost. Once that's done, the marginal revenue is no longer important. Now it's like, are they profitable at that level? And so you compare average cost to the price, and then you multiply it times the amount being sold, and that's how you get the profits. They can be negative if the average total cost is above the price. And remember, average total cost reflects like their production. So their production might have really high costs, and therefore it wouldn't be worth it for them to produce. So it means that their costs are too high for how much people are willing to pay, and therefore, yeah, it is a failure. All right, so again, just comparing monopoly versus perfect competition. So when Cecil Rhodes, the guy that consolidated De Beers back in the 1800s, when he consolidated many independent diamond producers into De Beers, he converted a perfectly competitive industry into a monopoly. It was a perfectly competitive industry prior to him doing this, and people were paying a lot less for this crappy, very clear, hard carbon that we all have to pay so much money for because certain people get to control how much we have to pay for it. Anyway, so before it was a competitive industry, so we can see how the market would function if it were a perfectly competitive industry. So compared with a perfectly competitive industry, a monopolist does the following. They produce a smaller amount, right? So for a perfectly competitive industry, they would operate at the point where marginal cost equals price. So they would operate here. So there would be almost twice as much output in this particular example. And of course, they charge a higher price. So in this case, the monopolist charges $600, whereas if this were a perfectly competitive market, the price would be a third of that. So you can see that monopolists do have a big effect on markets, especially in contrast to what they could be in a perfectly competitive market outcome. And of course, they earn a profit, even in the long run, versus what a competitive firm is able to do. All right, now let's look at another example more generally, looking at the more standard cost curves that we've talked about in the class. So here is, again, the monopolist demand curve. Here is the marginal revenue curve. And here is the swoosh-shaped marginal cost curve. Again, reflecting the fact that there are increasing returns to labor first and then decreasing or diminishing returns to labor after that, which starts to increase marginal costs. So the monopolist, again, sets their optimal output at the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And then they have to think about what their average total cost of producing is. Here's a U-shaped average total cost curve, again, reflecting the standard assumptions we made a few chapters back. So marginal cost equals marginal revenue here. That sets the output level. Then they go up to the demand curve to set the price. Once they've set the price, they have to figure out if they're profitable. They go down to the average total cost curve at that quantity to see the average total cost of producing. So the difference between the price and the average total cost is the profit for this one unit times all the units will get us to the profit of the monopolist. So profit is equal to the difference between total revenue and total cost. Total revenue is equal to price times quantity. And then total cost is equal to average total cost times the quantity produced. Just doing a little mathematical manipulation here, you can factor out the quantity supplied of the monopolist, and then you're left with QM times PM minus ATCM. So the quantity of the monopolist times the difference between the monopoly price and the average total cost, which is, again, what I said a second ago. So you have the price minus the average total cost times the quantity. That's how we derive that. So again, profit is equal to the area of the shaded rectangle with a height of PM minus ATC and a width of QM. So it's just different ways of calculating profit, of looking at what we're looking at here graphically. You can either calculate profit from totals, or you can calculate profit by looking at an individual unit and then multiplying it by the quantity, which is a better way to think about it when we're looking at it graphically. All right, so in chapter 12, we learned that a perfectly competitive industry can have profits in the short run, but not in the long run. In contrast, barriers to entry allow a monopolist to make profits in both the short run and the long run. So again, in the long run, firms cannot enter the market to take away these profits. So barriers to entry stop firms from entering the market. So monopolists will have monopoly into the indefinite future. The only thing that would change that is if their cost conditions change, demand conditions change, so the demand curve shifts, because the demand curve can shift, as we all know, based on the things that we talked about in the first few weeks of class. You know, differences in incomes, differences in prices of substitutes and complements, but there aren't any substitutes generally for goods in these monopoly markets. Something else that can happen is that the barriers to entry can be eroded, right? So that the legal protections can go away. A firm may be able to gather up enough capital to be able to set up shop and pay those high fixed costs to be able to enter and compete. So things can change, but generally, if there is a situation where a monopolist exists, like, they will have that power for a while, and those profits will persist for a while. All right, let's look at monopoly and public policy. So as I mentioned, because of the fact that firms have this power and they can charge high prices and they can limit the amount that's transacted in the market, then, you know, there's been enough of an awareness of this in our society that the government has put in certain fail-safes to try to, you know, control for it so that the situation is not as bad as it could potentially be. So let's look at the welfare effects of monopoly. Again, welfare in economics is the amount of efficiency in markets, which we can measure by consumer and producer surplus. So monopoly causes a net loss for society, meaning that even though some of the surplus that they capture is in profits, some surplus just becomes deadweight loss. So we'll again assume marginal costs are constant and horizontal just to make the analysis simple. So here's the total surplus with perfect competition. Price will equal marginal cost, so this will be the price here. So therefore, in this market, the total surplus will be a lot bigger than we'll see here. Here again is the marginal cost equals average total cost for the monopolist. Perfectly competitive market, price equals marginal cost here, so quantity of output will be here. So the consumer surplus will be the excess willingness to pay by all consumers in the market. The difference between how much each individual is willing to pay and the price they have to pay, right? Consumer surplus. A couple of months ago you covered it, but hopefully you learned something in this class, maybe, potentially. I'm sure some of you did. Not all of you. And I'm not talking to the people that are sitting in this room. I'm talking to everybody in my class. Some people aren't learning anything. It's unfortunate. Anyway, let's keep going. So in a perfectly competitive market, you're going to get the most efficient outcome. The people that can buy something will buy something. The most amount of excess willingness to pay will exist. So consumers will benefit the most from it. In a monopoly, again, monopolist sets their output at the point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, sets the price at that quantity level that people are willing to pay. Since there's no producer surplus when industry is perfectly competitive, the triangle here in the perfectly competitive market represents the total surplus. But total surplus is not just the consumer surplus in the monopoly market, because they do wind up with a profit as well. So we know this is the profit for the monopolist, the difference between the price and the average total cost of producing times the quantity. And this is the consumer surplus, right? These are the amount of people that are willing, that can pay for the good, given that this is the price. You have some people that have an excess willingness to pay, and they get some consumer surplus. And then you've got all these other people down here that have a willingness to pay that is below the price, and therefore they are not able to buy anything in the market. So the industry monopoly earns profit, which is also the producer surplus. So the profit for a monopolist is their producer surplus, and it's equal to the area of the orange rectangle. And it is what used to be consumer surplus in a perfectly competitive market. So essentially, it's like this area down here that was consumer surplus. It's now been captured by the monopolist as profit. So the sum of profit and consumer surplus, total surplus, is smaller under monopoly than under perfect competition. In Chapter 7, we analyze how taxes generate deadweight loss to society. Monopoly also creates a deadweight loss to society equal to the area of this black triangle. So again, it's going to be the amount of surplus that would have existed in the market had the market been allowed to operate at its most efficient level, where price equals marginal cost. So QM is the amount of output in the monopoly. This is how much would have been sold in the market, where price equals marginal cost. So again, this would be the base of the triangle. The height of the triangle is the difference between the price and the average cost of producing. So that area there, if we take the base times the height, would give us times 1/2, would give us the deadweight loss. How much surplus is lost in society due to the fact that monopolists have monopoly power and use it. So monopoly produces a net loss for society because some mutually beneficial transactions do not occur. So monopoly hurts the welfare of society as a whole and is a source of market failure. So remember, in economics, we're all about efficiency. Efficiency is maximizing the surplus in the markets, making sure that markets can operate the best way possible. When they are not able to operate the best way possible, you have what's called market failure. This is an example of that, where the monopolist is able to, again, charge prices above their marginal cost. The value to society of an additional good is the marginal revenue. The cost to society of an additional good is the marginal cost. And so setting the price above the marginal cost means that there are units in society that are valued greater than marginal cost that aren't being sold because the monopolist is not allowing it. All right, so because of that, again, governments have taken an active role in trying to lessen the amount of monopoly that exists. So policy towards monopoly depends crucially on whether or not the industry in question is a natural monopoly, one in which increasing returns to scale ensure that a bigger producer has lower average total cost. So here's a situation where a natural monopolist will likely exist. Here is their average total cost of producing. Here is the demand curve. So let's say this is QM. This is the amount that the monopolist would supply that would be profitable to them. They would charge that monopoly price, and their average total cost of producing would be below the price. If another firm were to enter the market, then they would have to divide up that quantity. That means that there would be two firms operating here selling that QM divided by 2, and their average total cost of producing would be above the demand curve, which means that they would be operating at a loss, which means that nobody would want to operate. And therefore, it doesn't make sense for there to be more than one firm in this market. It makes sense for there to be only one firm. So that's the case where you have the conditions for a natural monopoly. And that is the case where a government definitely needs to take a role, because because governments are generally trying to curtail monopoly power, but a situation like this requires monopoly, and therefore, if you're going to have a monopoly, you're going to have to control it, or else we are going to get, the long end of the stick. So over the last century, most monopolies that aren't natural have been broken up. The most celebrated example in the United States is the Standard Oil company, founded by John D. Rockefeller in 1870. In 1878, Standard Oil controlled almost all of the U.S. oil refining. In 1911, a court order broke the company up into a number of smaller units, including the companies that later became ExxonMobil. The government policies used to prevent or eliminate monopolies are known as antitrust policies. We'll talk more about them in, I think, the next chapter when we talk about oligopoly. But governments, I'm sure you've heard about antitrust policies before. I'm sure you heard about the robber barons and the post-industrial sort of taking of most of the wealth that these new burgeoning industries were able to generate. And that is actually what led to the creation of antitrust policies. All right, so we'll talk more about that in the next chapter, but let's talk specifically about dealing with the natural monopoly. So there's two common public policy solutions to the situation where there's a natural monopoly. One is just to take ownership of the natural monopoly. So you'll see conditions for a natural monopoly will generally exist in industries where, large numbers of consumers are being serviced for their electricity or their water or their wireless internet utilities, essentially. Those kind of situations require large amounts of fixed setup costs, which means that there's going to be a large spreading effect of those costs, which will dominate over the diminishing returns, which means that there will be decreasing average total cost for the relevant range of production, which means that, again, that will create a barrier to entry, and it won't make sense for other firms to be competing, because then they'd have to set up the same sort of operation and distribution, so you would have a natural monopoly. So, again, if you're going to have a natural monopoly, maybe the best thing is for the government to own it. So instead of allowing a private monopolist to control an industry, the government establishes a public agency to provide the good and protect consumers' interests. There are some examples of public ownership in the United States, not many. There's been a big trend to privatize over the last 30 or 40 years. So a lot of the industries that were in the public's hands are now in private hands. Obviously the mail service is still in public hands. So regular mail delivery is provided by the U.S. Postal Service. We also have passenger rail service provided by the public company Amtrak. We used to have the airlines also were owned by the government, and there was there were a lot more problems then than there are now with the airlines. Some cities, including Los Angeles, have publicly owned electric power companies, as you know. But again, it can be problematic. I'll talk about the issues right now. So the advantage of public ownership is that a publicly owned natural monopoly can set prices based on the criterion of efficiency rather than profit maximization. So instead of thinking about making $1 off of that last unit sold, making sure that marginal revenue is greater than or equal to marginal cost, they can simply be setting their output level to make the market as efficient as possible in order for there not to be any deadweight loss. So experience suggests that public ownership as a solution to the problem of natural monopoly often works badly in practice, though. The worst case scenario is when the government completely runs all industries. That's a command economy. That's what we saw in the Soviet Union. And what we see there is just an inability of the governments to work in the same way that prices do to sort of ration goods to the people that most need them. And so you wind up with all sorts of kind of distortions in what people need versus what's being produced. So a lot of what people need is not being produced. So you see a lot of lines for basic goods like bread and milk, whereas you might get a lot of baseball bats being produced for no reason, like just things of that sort, where it's like a lot of things that people don't need are available in abundance. And it usually has to do with corruption within the government, like giving contracts to certain firms that might benefit government officials versus not. So another reason is that publicly owned firms are often less eager than private companies to keep down costs or offer high quality products. So even when it is just one firm being run by the government, the way that the government operates is not necessarily going to result in the best production outcomes for the firms. Like governments have like a very sort of methodical way of going about things, and that can kind of be limiting sometimes. Sometimes in business, you need to be proactive. You need to be able to adapt and change. But when it comes to government-run enterprises, laws sort of establish how things should be done, and it's very rigid, and it's very difficult to get outside of it. And there isn't like a lot of room for sort of innovative thinking and flexibility, which can lead to like extremely high costs, even higher than they should be, and like crappy products being produced because quality is not ultimately what they're most interested in. Another potential problem is that publicly owned companies all too often end up serving political interests, providing contracts or jobs to people with the right connections. Again, corruption does tend to seep its ugly head into these enterprises. Amtrak has notoriously provided train service at a loss to destinations that attract few passengers, but that are located in the districts of influential members of Congress. So you'll see things like that, where again, just we're not using our resources to satisfy the most amount of people possible in the best way possible. So another thing that could be done instead of just taking control of these enterprises is to just regulate them, like set very stringent laws saying you can only behave in this very rigid way, and you cannot set your price high above marginal cost. You have to set your price equal to marginal cost, or somewhere in a reasonable range. So in the United States, the most common answer to natural monopoly has been to leave the industry in private hands but subjected to regulation. Most utilities like electricity, landline telephone service, natural gas, and so on are covered by price regulation that limits the prices that these firms can charge. So essentially they're setting a price ceiling, right? They're saying that the prices cannot go above a certain amount. A price ceiling on a monopolist need not create a shortage, since in the absence of a price ceiling, a monopolist would charge a price that is higher than its marginal cost of production. So when you have market failure and the price ceiling is being set in a market, you're not going to get that situation where the price cannot go above a certain amount, and so you're going to get that excess excess demand over supply. Like you're not going to get that kind of situation because there's already a problem in the market, and that is the deadweight loss by the monopolist. And so setting a price ceiling is actually going to work against that and improve the efficiency of the market. So let's look at how that works. So if forced to charge a lower price, as long as the price is above marginal cost and the monopolist at least breaks even on total output, the monopolist still has an incentive to produce the quantity demanded at that price. So here's the total surplus with an unregulated natural monopolist. Again, they said their output at the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Then they set the price where the consumers are willing to pay for that quantity. And then they look at their average cost of production to see how much it costs them on average to produce. The difference between that is their profit times the quantity is their total profit. And this is the consumer surplus from that. Suppose that regulators impose a price ceiling that falls below the monopoly price of PM and set it either above or equal to average total cost at PR. So here is the same situation, but there is a price ceiling being set by the government at PR. So essentially that price is being set at average total cost in this example. that's the best case scenario in which the firms are forced to make zero economic profit. The price they charge is equal to the average cost of producing. So they make zero economic profit, but they're still profitable. Like there's still that accounting profit that they make. So there's some money being made there. And of course, the regulators could set their price slightly above that just to maybe throw the firm a bone and give them a little bit of profit, but certainly not the price that they want to charge. So it would be somewhere between PM and PR. But PR is the regulated price is the best price that the government can regulate at without forcing the firm to be operating at a loss, which obviously would not be feasible in the long run. It would hurt taxpayers. So that is the best option there. So monopolist at this point is just willing to operate and produces the quantity demanded at that price. And we wind up with a large amount of consumer surplus. Again, the area below the demand curve and above the price. You see that the efficiency of this regulated market is a lot better than this market, where you get the consumer surplus and the profit representing the producer surplus. So consumer surplus is increased by regulation. Profits are eliminated and added instead to consumer surplus. So with the government getting involved, those profits go back to consumers as consumer surplus. People pay less, more people are able to buy, and more people are happy. The larger output and lower price lead to an overall increase in total surplus. Unfortunately, things are rarely that easy in practice. The main problem is that regulators don't have the information required to set the price exactly at the level at which the demand curve crosses the average total cost curve. So it's very difficult for a regulator to figure out exactly what that price is, where the demand curve equals the marginal cost of production. And so you're going to get, obviously, that gray area that's going to allow for a lot of sort of legal wrangling on the part of firms to be able to kind of coax the regulators to set prices higher than they would at the most efficient level. But also, they can also potentially set the price too low. Setting the price too low would create a shortage. In that case, you would be putting the price lower than the average cost of production, which means that the firm would be operating at a loss, which means that it would not produce that much. And so that could create its own new set of problems. So it's a very tricky sort of thing to set these regulations. It's not a clear-cut approach. It's not simple. It requires a lot of resources, legal resources especially, which means money. So there's a lot of battles always being waged whenever firms do find themselves in these situations, because obviously it benefits the firms to spend some money to try to fight for higher prices in order for them to get persistently higher profits in the long run. Also, regulated monopolies, like publicly owned firms, tend to exaggerate their costs to regulators and to provide inferior quality to consumers. So again, if regulators are trying to figure out that point where price equals average total cost, which equals marginal cost in the example we looked at, then the firms might, they might hide the nature of their actual costs or give the wrong idea of what those costs are in order to be able to set a higher price. And ultimately, the quality to consumers might be hurt by the fact that these firms are being regulated. They might just decide to produce less quality products. Some economists have argued that the best solution, even in the case of a natural monopoly, may be simply just to live with the natural monopoly. So that's a sentiment that exists. Obviously, it's not the best one, and we shouldn't be complacent with these things. And we're not, really. We do have a good amount of public institutions that are constantly monitoring markets, making sure that if there are monopolies, they are regulated somewhat. And if firms are trying to get bigger to eventually get that monopoly power, that we are either stopping them or setting some conditions for them becoming that big. All right, so one related concept that we need to consider is a situation where there isn't a sole seller of a good, but there's a sole buyer of a good, When there's a sole buyer of a good, it's called a monopsony. A monopsony exists when there is only one buyer of a good. A monopsonist is a firm that is the sole buyer in a market. Like a monopolist, a monopsonist will distort the competitive market outcome in order to capture more of the surplus. So in this case, they are able to basically have control over how much is transacted in the market by being the only buyer in the market. So the monopsonist will do this through quantity purchased and price paid for good rather than through quantity sold and price charged for goods. Monopsony, although it does exist, is rarer than a monopoly. The classic example is a single employer in a small town. So if there's a small town, you can maybe think about Flint, Michigan. Flint, Michigan used to have GM in it, and they were basically like the only producer of anything in that town worthwhile. They left Flint, Michigan a while back, and basically the town is now like a graveyard. Michael Moore did a documentary on it. This is one of his first ones if you want to check it out. It's kind of interesting about the fact that GM left and they kind of just decimated the economy in this town. When they were there, they were basically the sole buyer of labor, right? So when you think about labor markets, people that are working are supplying labor, and people that are buying are purchasing labor. So when you only have one employer in a town, then they are essentially a monopsonist. They get to decide how much is going to be bought, how much labor is going to be bought, and they get to decide how much that labor is going to be bought for. So you will see in a situation like this, the wages being artificially lower than they should be, given normal like market conditions in the labor market. So just as a monopolist creates a deadweight loss by producing too little of output, a monopsonist creates a deadweight loss by hiring too few workers and thereby producing too little output as well. So again, they hire too few workers, they pay them less than what they normally would get, and they also wind up producing less as well. In 2014, when the two largest cable providers, Time Warner Cable and Comcast, announced their intention to merge, questions of monopoly and monopsony arose. Monopoly because the combined companies would cover 30 million subscribers, an overwhelming portion of Americans with cable access. But a monopsony because the combined company would be virtually the only purchaser of programming by companies that produce shows for broadcast. So again, like these services operate in different markets, right? So they operate in the market for selling cable services to consumers, but they also operate as a buyer of content to be distributed on their distribution networks. And so again, this planned merger at the time was going to have implications on both markets, and so everything had to be taken into consideration. And it was, I believe, they were eventually stopped from merging, and that's something that our Justice Department and our Federal Trade Commission is responsible for. We'll talk more about that in the next chapter, but they essentially monitor these kind of merges, and they have different measures to kind of see how like their bigger slice of the pie of these industries is going to affect prices, is going to affect the amount that's transacted, is going to affect efficiency. And if they decide that it's not going to work out in an efficient way, they will sue the companies to stop them from merging. And the companies can fight, but ultimately it does wind up being a losing battle, and there's a lot of resources that are wasted. Sometimes the firms are able to argue that they should have a right to merge, and we'll talk more about that next time. All right, so we're not going to finish this chapter today. So again, you will have another free weekend, but make sure you guys do take advantage of this time. Honestly, like, this is not just me talking just for the sake of talking. Like, this is an important time for you guys. This is the last few weeks of the semester. Like, really make it worth your while. Make it count, so that, again, you can have a really great summer feeling good about what happened these last few weeks, all right? Have a good weekend. I'll see you on Tuesday.